The end of Doctor Who Season 38 has given us pretty much the biggest lore dump of any episode since 1976, when the word Gallifrey was first spoken on screen. So, I wanted to run through the timeline of Gallifrey and the Doctor as best as we currently understand them, and try to put all our new information into context. It goes without saying, major spoilers for Season 38 and pretty much every other season of Doctor Who ever will follow. And one important caveat. All this new information is narrated by the Master, who is pretty much the unreliabliest of unreliable narrators. So there's still some chance that it's all a complete lie he came up with to troll the Doctor. I doubt it, though. I think the showrunners have plans for the next few seasons of the show that are being set up here, so I really doubt they're going to just retcon it all out anytime soon.
First time in my life, I can honestly say every word is true.
Long, long ago, we learn, a people called the Shobogans lived on a sparsely populated planet called Gallifrey. Whether that was the name of a species, a nationality, a gender, we don't know. But exactly one of the Shobogans, named Tecteun, had developed interstellar flight and was in the process of exploring the universe. She found a certain distant planet with a mysterious portal of unknown origins, supposedly leading beyond the known universe, and outside that portal, a lone child. I will pause here to note that Season 38 also reminded us in another story that there is precedent for beings from other realities coming into this reality. So instead of going through the mysterious portal and exploring, Tecteun decides to pick up this child, settle down, and raise her, which seems a bit out of character. Fortunately for Tecteun, she turns out to be a strange child, dare I say, an unearthly child, who completely regenerates her body after a fatal injury, hence the name Timeless Child. So Tecteun, intrigued, goes through a pretty creepy process of apparently inducing a bunch of regenerations in this child to figure out how the process works. Let's note the last regeneration in the montage here. He'll be important later. The TARDIS Wiki identifies this uncredited actor as Jesse Dei. He'll be known as the Dei Timeless Child hereinafter. So, Tecteun succeeds, implants the genetic code of regeneration in herself, and is reborn in a new body. She passes that knowledge on to the other Shobogans she happens to like, and it becomes one of the bases of a new Gallifreyan civilization, ruled by an elite who begin calling themselves Time Lords. The rest of the Shobogans presumably continue to live outside the shiny new citadel and do less exciting things with their lives. Now, this doesn't touch on where the time part came from. What we know from elsewhere is that an engineer/architect named Rassilon and a stellar scientist named Omega came up with a plan to blow up a star using a device called the Hand of Omega, and use the energy of the explosion to create an Eye of Harmony that would later provide the necessary energy for the new time-faring civilization of Gallifrey.
Rassilon Star, the Eye of Harmony.
Omega was lost and presumed dead during the testing of his device. Spoiler alert, he wasn't.
As you can see,
leaving Rassilon to take the credit and be remembered as the founder of Time Lord civilization.
To Rassilon, the greatest single figure in Time Lord history.
At some point, the early Time Lords also create the Matrix to store their shared memory, and invent/grow TARDISes as their main means of time travel. Now, Season 38 was happily name-dropping everything it could from the classic series, so the fact that the secret history of the Time Lords made no mention of Rassilon is a rather curious omission. But I will point out this one clip here where we see Time Lord Tecteun stalking down a corridor to meet two other faceless Time Lords, who could be intended to represent Rassilon and Omega. The early Time Lords do not use their great power with much responsibility at all. One well-documented aspect of this is that they enjoy using a device called a time scoop to kidnap life forms from throughout time imprisoned them in a charming place called the Death Zone, and forced them to fight each other. Another thing they do is try to accelerate the development of a planet called Minyos.
They went to war with each other, learned how to split the atom, discovered a toothbrush, and finally split the planet.
Officially, Rassilon eventually decided he had had enough of this and reformed Time Lord Society.
But there are many rumors and legends to the contrary. Some say his fellow Time Lords rebelled against his cruelty.
Possibly with the help of some of these non-Time Lord Shibogans who are still around. But in any case, they adopted the policy of non-intervention specifically because of the Minion incident. They shut down the Death Zone, entombed Rassilon in it as a warning against hubris. So where was Tecteun during all of this? Well, presumably he was disappeared and forgotten somehow, much like Omega. But it's possible he was still around and participating in these events. There's a good chance, I think, that the 12 regeneration limit was also a reaction to this period of time, so that sure seems like it was Tecteun's doing. And thus begins what we could call the classical age of Gallifrey. The Time Lords withdraw from the universe, observing but never interfering, fussing about with their headwear and their procedures. The remaining Shibogans remain outside the cities, eventually joined by Time Lord exiles and outcasts and become known as the Outsiders. And at some point, some Gallifreyans also depart and form a sisterhood centered around producing the Elixir of Life, presumably an alternative path to regeneration for people who weren't friends with Tecteun. The ancient history of Gallifrey ends up mythologized and mostly forgotten. They completely forget, for example, that the Eye of Harmony is an actual thing. And this goes on for quite a long time.
The Minion civilization was destroyed 100,000 years ago.
For some definition of years and ago, but that is the sort of timescale we're dealing with. So, what were Tecteun and the Timeless Child doing for 100,000 odd years? This is where the Season 38 reveal starts to make everything particularly wibbly. Well, let's begin with what we do know. At some point, for unknown reasons, the Timeless Child regenerates into a body that looks like William Hartnell. Give or take a few gray hairs and wrinkles, perhaps. And apparently he remembers nothing of his past and sees himself as an ordinary Time Lord, more or less. He does remember a reasonable amount from his childhood, however, from what we see on screen.
I'm with my father. We're lying back in the grass. It's a warm Gallifreyan night.
Gallifreyan?
Gallifrey!
You had a grandmother? I had 7, but Granny 5, my favourite, used to tell me about the solid tract.
I can't apologise enough. I thought you were just a useless gadget. I thought you were just an embarrassing present from a dull godmother with 2 heads and bad breath.
Have you got a brother?
No, not anymore. Just me.
Sisters. I used to have sisters. I used to be a sister in an aqua hospital. Actually turned out to be a training camp for the Quiston calcium assassins.
Going off on one again.
Okay, maybe not that last one. He later misses his family and his remembered life.
Probably can't remember your family.
Oh, yes, I can when I want to. And that's the point, really. I have to really want to bring them back in front of my eyes. The rest of the time, they sleep in my mind, and I forget. And so will you.
Do you have any family yourself?
I don't know.
Oh, I'm sorry. It's the war, isn't it? Must be terrible not knowing.
Yes.
Have you got family?
No. Lost them a long time ago.
How'd you cope with that?
I carry them with me. What they would have thought and said and done make them a part of who I am. So even though they're gone from the world, they're never gone from me.
He liked to hide in a barn in the middle of nowhere.
He can't just run away crying all the time if he wants to join the army.
He doesn't want to join the army, I keep telling you.
Well, he's not going to the academy, is he, that boy? He'll never make a Time Lord.
The point is that day was not only my blackest, it was also my best.
He eventually met a Time Lord hermit who would later be known as Kanpo Rinpoche of a Buddhist abbey on Earth.
Well, when I was a little boy, we used to live in a house that was perched halfway up the top of a mountain. And behind our house, there sat under a tree an old man, a hermit, a monk. And he listened whilst I poured out my troubles to him. I was too unhappy even for tears, I remember. When I'd finished, he He lifted a skeletal hand and he pointed. Do you know what he pointed at?
No.
A flower. One of those little weeds. Just like a daisy it was.
So, possibly by taking that advice to heart, he did eventually become a Time Lord of the Prydonian chapter. On his initiation at the age of 8, he looked into the untempered schism and ran away. He met another young Time Lord, who would later be called the Master. The two of them spent a lot of time running from a particular teacher named Borusa.
The leader of the Prydonian chapter? The chapter that has produced more Time Lord presidents than all other chapters together?
At some point, he sneaks into the cloisters under the Citadel and hears a prophecy about something called the Hybrid. He claims later not to remember the specifics.
The last I heard, he stole the moon and the president's wife.
Ah, well, that was a lie put about by the Shabugans. It was the president's daughter. I didn't steal the moon, I lost.
Whatever that means.
There's feet, innit? Feet of Sigma. Come on, feet. Class of 92.
Drax.
Yeah, we was on the tech course together. Long time ago now, Fee, eh? Must be what? 450 years? And a long way from Gallifrey. Yeah. Temporal theory did me. Still, you did well, mine, getting your doctorate and all that.
As a matter of fact, I had a great deal to do with the banning of these manuscripts. I managed to persuade the High Council of the Time Lords they were an offense against the dignity of sentient life forms.
But I thought the Time Lords never interfered.
But frankly, I made such a nuisance of myself that...
I was a dad once. Don, I've been a father before. What? Lost all that a long time ago.
And depending on how reliable a source you think Clara Oswald pretending to be the Doctor is...
I was born on the planet Gallifrey, in the constellation of Castorberus. I'm a Time Lord, but my Prydonian privileges were revoked when I stole a time capsule and ran away. Currently pilot Type 40 TARDIS, I've been married 4 times, all deceased. My children and grandchildren are missing, and I assume dead. I have a non-Gallifreyan daughter created via genetic transfer. How much more do you need? I'm the Doctor.
This information is not proof.
Eventually, the child gets bored with Time Lord life. He steals a TARDIS, begins calling himself the Doctor, and runs off. With him is an apparently Gallifreyan woman named Susan, who calls him grandfather. She's that president's wife and/or daughter. He also has, for some reason, that Hand of Omega from earlier. His stated goal is to understand the balance of good and evil in the universe.
So why does good prevail?
He eventually decides that the balance exists because people like him choose to be good, and starts meddling for the sake of goodness. One regeneration later, the Time Lords catch the Troughton Doctor and put him on trial. He argues that despite Time Lord policy, his interference is necessary for the good of history. The Time Lords punish him by forcing him to regenerate and exiling him to Earth. So, we now have some loose ends to fit around that story somehow. Let's start with the simplest one. Later on, the Tom Baker Doctor gets into a brain fight with an evil Time Lord named Morbius, and sees flashbacks into his past in the process. Then, he sees these 8 other faces. Who are they? Well, out of universe, they were all members of the Doctor Who production staff. Producer Philip Hinchcliffe, who happened to be one of them, said he intended them to be interpreted as earlier regenerations of the Doctor.
How far, Doctor? How long have you lived?
Subsequent writing of the series, though, heavily implied that the Doctor sees Hartnell as his own first regeneration, and doesn't remember being any of these 8 people.
Regeneration. 4th. Goodness me, so there are 5 of me now.
12 regenerations, Clara. I can't ever do it again. This is where I end up.
Hence the popular alternate theory that they are actually Morbius's faces. They come up again, however, in The Timeless Children, where the Whittaker Doctor uses a similar memory brain blast to break herself out of the Matrix. This would seem to imply that she now sees them as a noteworthy part of her own past. Now, I personally doubt whether we'll ever see any of these 8 people in this series meaningfully, if for no other reason than that the actors look way different now. So, I think their relevance will remain somewhat ambiguous going forward. What I personally think happened is that, while fighting Morbius, the Tom Baker Doctor saw flashes of these faces with no more idea of what they mean than the audience did. Since he knows his own past, he concluded, like the audience, that they were probably something to do with Morbius and forgot about them. Except that, many years later, when the Whittaker Doctor learned that her life seemingly didn't begin as the Hartnell Doctor, she remembers these faces and rethinks that conclusion. She still has no clear idea of what they do mean, but they feed into her overall sense of questioning her own identity, and that is why they show up in that blast of confused memory that she hits the Matrix with. So, what specifically they actually are is left somewhat indeterminate, and will likely remain that way. So, let's move on to the more complicated questions. Season 38 also introduces this person, played by Jo Martin. She calls herself the Doctor. She travels in a TARDIS shaped like a 1960s British phone booth, and neither she nor the Whittaker Doctor recognize each other. So, she's a doctor, but she isn't plainly either a past or a future Doctor. So, what do we know? First of all, we know that the current Doctor's memories have been manipulated in some way. There is at least one huge 100,000-year gap in her memories. So there's plenty of space for past regenerations, at least pre-Hartnell ones. It is also possible that the Martin Doctor is from somewhere in the Doctor's future, and her memories have been re-wiped again for unknown reasons, but that seems to defy narrative conservation. We already know that information has been removed from the Doctor's past, so the Martin Doctor is probably connected to that known gap. But the name the Doctor, as far as we know, was chosen by the Hartnell Doctor at some point, and the Master remembers him choosing it.
As you chose yours. The man who makes people better.
Additionally, the first time the Doctor's TARDIS got stuck in that police box shape was during Hartnell's time, when he first travelled with some stray humans from 1960s London to the Stone Age.
It's still a police box. Why hasn't it changed?
I should have waited till they'd done the chameleon conversion, but there were rather pressing reasons at the time.
So, if Martin has those Hartnell-specific features, that seems to make it almost certain that she must come after Hartnell. Let me note here that the Timeless Children makes sure to show a couple of other borrowed TARDISes, disguised with functioning chameleon circuits for the first time since the 2005 reveal, and even name drops the term chameleon circuit. So it's not like the writers have forgotten this point. So from all this, it seems that the Martin Doctor has to come sometime after Hartnell, sometime before Whittaker, during a period which no other Doctor seems to remember. But we've basically seen every regeneration during that interval on screen, and Martin certainly didn't show up anywhere in there, right? Well, there is one lingering exception. We never saw the regeneration from Troughton to Pertwee on screen. We just see Troughton disappear into swirlies, and then Pertwee pops out of the TARDIS on Earth. So, there is room for just about anything to happen in between, up to and including completely separate regenerations. Moreover, there were a couple of guest appearances by the Troughton Doctor much later. In one, he remembers an incident regarding his companions that didn't happen until moments before the end of his last televised story.
The Time Lords erased your memory of the period you spent with me.
In another, he claims to be on a mission from the Time Lords, who he spent his entire televised time running away from.
I'm a pariah, exiled from Time Lord society, so they can always deny sending me.
So, there is some wonkiness with the Troughton Doctor's timeline already, and fans have long speculated that there might be an untelevised Season 6B, where the Troughton Doctor's sentence gets intercepted by some other Time Lord faction, he reunites with his companions, he goes on secret missions for the Time Lords for a while, and then they eventually get tired of him and send him on to Earth to fulfill his exile. So it's not too much of a stretch to assume that at some point during Season 6B, the Troughton Doctor regenerates into the Martin Doctor, gets tired of working for the Time Lords, goes into hiding on Earth, is temporarily discovered by the Jadoon, but escapes with the help of the Whittaker Doctor, later gets caught again, and finally exiled to Earth in a disabled TARDIS, looking like John Pertwee, right? Now, one minor quibble here is that the Martin Doctor may not initially recognize the Whittaker Doctor's sonic screwdriver. Now, the Troughton Doctor did own a sonic screwdriver.
A little more than a screwdriver. Just watch this.
So, the Martin Doctor, if she did indeed come after Troughton, should know what a sonic screwdriver is. Well, for one thing, the modern sonic screwdriver doesn't look very much like the one Troughton had, so she may just not have recognized it on sight. For another thing, she doesn't say that she doesn't recognize it, she just refers to it as
that cute little gizmo of yours.
Not recognizing it was just Whittaker's interpretation of this. She then says that she is
smart enough not to need one.
Which sure implies to me that she knows what it is by name, at least. So to me, the sum of all our current information really strongly tells me that Martin has to come somewhere between Troughton and Pertwee. Except for one thing. Another bit of what the Master tells the Doctor in The Timeless Children is that there is a huge chunk of information concerning the Timeless Child's involvement with a secret organization called the Division, which has been thoroughly wiped from the Matrix beyond the Master's ability to recover it. Now, the Division certainly seems like the kind of organization that would intervene in the Doctor's sentencing by the Time Lord Council in the War Games and recruit him for secret missions, and they certainly seem like the kind of organization that the Doctor would go into hiding to get away from. So, that chapter sure seems like it would fit neatly into what we know of the Martin Doctor and the Season 6B timeline. We also see what seems to be a brief glimpse of the Timeless Child being recruited into the Division, and the dialogue here via a Division agent apparently named Solpato in the credits, and wearing a similar funny hat to Gat, really feels to me like it follows straight from the Troughton's Doctor's impassioned defense of meddling in the universe for the sake of goodness.
You have heard the charge against you, that you have repeatedly broken our most important law of non-interference in the affairs of other planets.
True, I am guilty of interference. Just as you are guilty of failing to use your great powers to help those in need.
The policy of the Time Lords is clear. Strict non-intervention in other worlds and times. However, policy and reality sometimes diverge. There are times when it is necessary to intervene.
But visually, what we see in this scene is what appears to be the Dei Timeless Child. Remember him? With ancient Rassilon-era Tecteun sitting alongside him. And you would really have to stretch to make another Dei look-alike regeneration fit in between Troughton and Martin, not to mention Tecteun, seemingly sitting around unaging for all the 100,000 odd years since he was last seen, and just popping up suddenly to introduce the Doctor to the Division. So the visuals involved strongly suggest that this scene happens fairly shortly after the non-interference policy was first adopted, very early in Time Lord history, while both the Timeless Child and Tecteun maintained these appearances. So, how do we reconcile this? I honestly don't know. I have a very hard time believing that a pre-Hartnell, pre-Doctor, Rassilon-era Timeless Child takes an active interest in meddling with history, applies to join the Division, starts calling herself the Doctor, traveling in a TARDIS shaped like a 1960s police box, gets fed up and goes into hiding, gets her memory mysteriously wiped, then goes through another Gallifreyan childhood where she coincidentally decides to give herself exactly the same name and travel in a TARDIS with the same bug in it, gets put on trial again for repeated meddling. I guess it could happen if repressed memory or other influences are leading her to relive the same choices over and over again somehow, but it just seems like really awkward writing to me.
Why would they do that?
Let us remember, however, that these images are only barely there in the Matrix, and heavily filtered by overlaid images of an Irish policeman named Brendan.
I want to make a difference.
So, it is very possible that this isn't a literal representation of what that meeting really looked like. It's just the Doctor or the Matrix trying to extrapolate fragmented information about the Timeless Child into something visually coherent.
I deny this reality. The reality is a computation matrix.
Another oddity worth noting is that the Master was able to recover the fundamental secret about the Timeless Child and Tecteun, but not the details of what the Timeless Child did as a seemingly fairly standard operative of the Division. One would think that the former would be a much bigger secret, and would be at least as well protected, if not more so. One plausible explanation for this weird separation of security measures, I think, is that Tecteun himself redacted information about the identity of the Timeless Child soon after the creation of the Matrix, and that the Division much later came along and redacted information about a key operative with much better technology. Two separate secrets, two separate protection measures. So, what I'm going to propose until further information presents itself is this. Tecteun and the Timeless Child are either imprisoned or go into hiding during the ascendancy of Rassilon, and Rassilon is all too happy to leave them forgotten. Probably they're in a bubble universe or moved around in time or something, so they're not literally sitting around doing nothing for 100,000 years. The Timeless Child, at least, if he is anything like the Doctor we know, has a very hard time sitting still and going unnoticed for long. For some reason, at least the Timeless Child gets sent or brought back to Gallifrey, either by Tecteun himself or someone else on Gallifrey. For some reason, said party decides to hide the Timeless Child as an ordinary Gallifreyan child. That child grows up as previously described, makes waves, runs off, makes more waves, gets arrested and put on trial. The division then intervenes in the sentencing, probably with Tecteun nudging them somehow, and offers the Doctor the chance to do all the meddling he wants. He does so for a while, regenerates, runs off again, eventually gets caught again, gets fired from the division, has her memory wiped again, and all relevant information expunged from the Matrix, and then pops right into exile on Earth, where he's supposed to be, with both him and the Time Lord Council none the wiser. Meaning, this scene we see in the Matrix, as it literally happened, would have included the Troughton Doctor sitting with Tecteun looking however he or she does at the time. And that is my best attempt to de-wibbly the information we have at this time. We'll see how the writers themselves eventually choose to untangle it. One interesting loose end here is that the Doctor gets recruited over his next several regenerations for missions done on behalf of the Time Lords.
Then we can use the Doctor to deal with this problem.
Something's operating it by remote control. The Time Lords. You don't really think that our appearance on the planet of Peladon at this precise crisis in their history was just coincidence, do you?
Time Lords again.
No, it's a container of some kind, Joe. From them.
Time Lords?
That's right.
Meddlesome interfering idiots. Dragging us 1,000 parsecs off course.
Oi, have you gone potty? What are you shouting at?
The Time Lords, who else?
Occasionally, not continually. We ask you to do something for us.
I won't do it.
Which seems pretty strange for people who are never ever supposed to interfere with anything.
We Time Lords don't care to be conspicuous. Some of us, that is.
The most notable of these, of course, is literally starting the Time War by trying to wipe the Daleks out of history, and later blowing up their sun with that Hand of Omega that he grabbed on his way off Gallifrey for some reason. So, did the division still have some lingering control of the Doctor that allowed them to influence him into these very un-Time Lord-like activities on their behalf? Unknown. One thing we do hear is that the Doctor's exile is eventually rescinded by request of a Time Lord organization called the Celestial Intervention Agency. This apparently happens after he prevented Omega, remember him, from draining Gallifrey's energy in order to return from the antimatter universe where he was trapped. What the CIA is and how it might or might not relate to the division is unknown. They sure seem like they do basically the same stuff, but at least the existence of the CIA seems to be fairly common knowledge to Time Lords, given the way they talk about it here.
The sentence was subsequently remitted at the intercession of the CIA.
Celestial Intervention Agency. They get their fingers into everything.
But we never learned anything further about it on screen. I would also point out that the note about the CIA pertaining to the Doctor was in the Doctor's biodata extract from the Matrix, which the Master had recently been messing around with. By the way, the Tom Baker Doctor ends up being Lord President of Gallifrey somewhere around here. He doesn't seem too bothered about it, though.
Is there anything I can get for you, sir?
Yes, a jelly baby. My right-hand pocket.
At least except when it suits him. So a couple of Gallifreyan crises later, the Colin Baker Doctor gets put on trial, again, for meddling, and later, genocide.
By order of the High Council, this is an impartial inquiry into the behavior of the accused person, known as the Doctor, who is charged, but he on divers occasions has been guilty of conduct unbecoming a Time Lord.
Not guilty!
The prosecutor, the Valeyard, also happens to be the Doctor. Or so the Master claims, at least. Now, the Valeyard may not be a real Doctor. He may just be a projection from the Matrix created by the Time Lords or something as a perfect prosecutor for the Doctor.
There's only one person in the universe who hates me as much as you do.
The Master describes the Valeyard as
It's an amalgamation of the darker sides of your nature, somewhere between your 12th and final incarnation.
Now, obviously, we are well past there now, and there is no sign of any such person. Let us note, however, that a forgotten era of the Doctor's life, where he was working for a secret Gallifreyan organization, would actually be the perfect place for the Valeyard as an actual regeneration to fit in. The Master may have just misread whatever he learned about the Valeyard in the Matrix, given how borked the Doctor's regenerative history is relative to a normal Time Lord. And this whole subplot...
To protect their own secrets, they drew the Earth and its constellation billions of miles across space,
causing the fireball which nearly destroyed the planet.
Of little consequence in the High Council's planning. The robot recovery mission from Andromeda sped past Earth, out into space. Gallifreyan secrets were saved.
Sure sounds like something the Division and/or the CIA would be involved in. Wouldn't it be interesting if the Doctor, him or herself, were the agent responsible for the Ravlox incident? It may also be notable that the Valeyard, in the process of supposedly prosecuting the Doctor, happens to hand him exactly the 2 pieces of backstory he needs to take note of a couple of major incidents of illegal Time Lord interference, which he presumably wasn't aware of until he got summoned away to this trial.
10 million years of absolute power. That's what it takes to be really corrupt.
So, whose side was the Valeyard on again? By the way, the whole Time Lord High Council was supposedly deposed off-screen during this trial sequence.
High Council has been deposed. Insurrectionists are running amok on Gallifrey.
Thank you, Keeper. That is the news I've been awaiting.
As far as I know, this has no particular on-screen consequences. But shortly thereafter, the last great time war between the Daleks and Time Lords begins, instigated largely by the aforementioned secret missions carried out by the Doctor. As part of the Time War, important past Time Lords are resurrected to participate in the war.
The Time Lords only resurrected me because they knew I'd be the perfect warrior for a time war.
This resurrection business sure seems like the kind of thing that Tecteun would be involved in, by the way. The Doctor himself tries for a while to stay out of it, but eventually gets reluctantly drawn in. The Time War proceeds for however long, and eventually it gets to the point where the Daleks have surrounded Gallifrey and are bombarding it to destruction. The High Council, under the leadership of the resurrected Rassilon, tries to transport Gallifrey away from the Time War, along a trail produced by the Master's Crazy Drums. It's not particularly important except to note that this woman, supposedly a Time Lord being punished for speaking against Rassilon's plan, exists. I don't think we know who she is any more than we did back in 2010. She's someone who the Doctor seems to recognize, and right now we don't have any reason to think that the Doctor would suddenly recognize Tecteun. There are plenty of other reasonable options from the Doctor's own conscious knowledge. She could be this particular important woman from the barn, I guess, except that she doesn't seem like the type who would be voting on the High Council. It could be any other Time Lord the Doctor ever knew. Could be Romana, Flavia, the Inquisitor. Hell, Time Lords are canonically genderless now. It could be Drax, or Campo, or Barusa. In fact, that is my pet theory now. She is a resurrected Barusa, giving her old student one last lesson. Done. Meanwhile, the hurt Doctor, the one actively participating in the Time War, decides he doesn't care anymore, steals a weapon called the Moment, and uses it to kill everyone involved. Or so he thinks. The Moment itself actually intervenes at the last moment to bring in a couple of future Doctors who concoct a plan to instead zap Gallifrey away into a pocket dimension, leaving the encircling Daleks to blow themselves up in the crossfire. The concealed Time Lords begin poking holes in the universe, trying to find a way back in. And for some reason they need to ask the Doctor for permission to return.
If you speak your name, the Time Lords will return.
After these holes accidentally destroy the universe a couple of times,
I rebooted it, put it all back together again.
That's good.
The Doctor finally finds exactly the right hole to hear their message, and dithers about for hundreds of years deciding whether or not to reply. Now, the Smith Doctor believes that he's on his last regeneration and about to die after waiting around on Trenzalore for those hundreds of years. Eventually, his companion tells the Time Lords to just give the Doctor some more regenerations. They do so. And then, they wander off. Given, however, that the Doctor is not a Time Lord as created by Tecteun, and probably not actually bound by the regeneration limit, what does this accomplish? Well, if nothing else, it keeps him believing that he is just a regular Time Lord. The Time Lords responsible probably don't know any better anyway, but it's possible that Tecteun is involved behind the scenes somehow. Manipulating regeneration energy is kind of his thing. This also does happen to have the side effect of giving the Doctor a whole bunch of extra regeneration energy he can use to blast a whole fleet of Daleks out of the sky, which might be important to someone. There is the additional possibility that the Timeless Child was indeed modified like all other Time Lords to be subject to the limit after all, and he actually did need the extra energy from Gallifrey for this regeneration. You'd think this might have been a problem if there was indeed at least one extra regeneration between Hartnell and Smith, but the Division or Tecteun could have fixed it up so his count stayed consistent. He could also be incorrect about that business with the severed hand turning into a sex doll for Rose Tyler actually counting as regeneration for all we know. Maybe he was just guessing because he sensed he was on his last regeneration earlier than he expected. The Time Lords then become suddenly obsessed with the prophecy of the hybrid generated by the Matrix long ago, which the Doctor supposedly heard and might know something about. So they hijack a confession dial the Capaldi Doctor had previously prepared, expecting his own imminent death, and use it to torture him for 4 billion years, until he explains. Instead, he follows the signal back to Gallifrey, deposes Rassilon as president, and generally causes trouble. Nothing much comes of it, though. I guess Rassilon's still out there somewhere, though. Some time later, the Master enters the Matrix again, and uncovers all this information about the Timeless Child and Tecteun, and he is so horrified by the idea that he owes his existence as a Time Lord to the Doctor that he destroys Gallifrey. Again. Perhaps this was a particularly easy time to do it with political disarray after Rassilon's removal. He tries to do something with Cybermen afterwards. As far as we know, it didn't really work out for him. And at this point, Gallifrey is ruined and lifeless. And as far as we know, that's the end of Gallifrey. Except I guess Macy Williams is still lurking around the Citadel for a while yet. And that is my best effort to work out the current timelines of the Doctor and of Gallifrey. A lot of this is likely to need reevaluation with future information, especially around the details about the Doctor's dying with the Division, since that seems likely to be an active area of focus for the show for the next few seasons. But for now, it is at least possible to come up with a timeline that is reasonably consistent. I am aware that there is a lot of additional information in the spin-off novels and audio dramas and whatever. If anyone really wants to try to work those into a coherent timeline, good luck.